Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. India unveiled its first national hydrogen policy in January this year with an aim to boost production and use of cleaner sources of energy. This is especially important given our commitment to net zero emissions and also the threat of an energy crisis looming large in the world. To discuss the various facets of the policy and also to talk about the potential of green hydrogen as a fuel, we have Rajat Seksaria, CEO of Acme Clean Tech, which is one of the largest renewable companies in India. Rajat has spent the last 18 years in the power sector, and you can listen to him also on episode 76 of the Bharatvaarta podcast, where he speaks about the sector in general. Welcome, Rajat. Thank you again for making the time.
Thanks, Roshan, for inviting me. And as you said, this is my second visit to this podcast, and this is likely to be more focused discussion on hydrogen, a subject I have been pursuing both professionally and as my passion area. So it will be good to interact on various facets of this very interesting and disruptive energy sector movement, if I can call, we are having right now.
No, absolutely. I think especially over the last year, everyone has sort of focused on energy, right? And it's become it's really come to the fore as one of those key things that people have to understand. Before we discuss the policy nuances and so on, can you talk to us about the potential of hydrogen as a fuel and also explain the various nomenclatures associated with it, such as green hydrogen, gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and so on?
Yeah. So I think, Roshan, that's a good point to start this interaction on. Fundamentally, understanding hydrogen will take us back to our basic elementary chemistry that we all studied in our school days. So what we need to keep in mind, all energy that we use globally today essentially is driven by hydrogen. It is mankind's bad fortune that around 150 years back, we rode on a carbon wave. So the hydrogen in that then was attached with various forms of carbon, whether it was in form of coal or various oil-related products. So essentially, if you remember those complex formulas, C2H6, H4, everywhere essentially will get hydrogen. So the essence of energy was in hydrogen. What we didn't do, unfortunately, then, though we had the scientifically discovered other ways of using hydrogen, we didn't go on a non-carbon route. For example, hydrogen can be directly used. It doesn't need to be attached. If hydrogen can also be used by combining with nitrogen and making it, let's say, ammonia or methanol, right? So there are other ways in which hydrogen can also be kind of carried or transported or be used. But unfortunately, at that point in time, our scientific discoveries, our scientific route that we took or the developed nations took at that point in time led to a route which essentially was a carbon heavy route. And today, 150 years down the line, we as global citizens or as humanity are reassessing the cost of going that route. So if there was one thing we could have done going back in time, we could have seriously evaluated a completely different route of energy rather than attaching ourselves with carbon. So that is why hydrogen continues to be the center piece of how do we decarbonize today. So this is the essential element about hydrogen, that it's the core of energy. Second very important point about hydrogen, especially in terms of nomenclature that a lot of us must be reading, hearing, is people talk about green hydrogen, which is the flavor of the year, if you can call. But then people also hear about blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen. For good measure, you also have pink hydrogen and turquoise hydrogen. So for people who may not be familiar with the terminology, at times this can make for complexity in understanding what people are talking about. So I think what is very important to get this color coding understanding right for anyone who wants to understand this sector is they are essentially just nomenclature to denote how a particular molecule of hydrogen has been produced. The chemically hydrogen remains the same, whether it is green, blue, gray, turquoise, pink, whatever. So for example, any hydrogen which is produced using renewable energy like solar, wind, even hydro is considered renewable energy, then it is from a terminology point of view, it's called green. Conventionally, hydrogen has been produced using something called steam methane reforming, primarily through natural gas, that is called gray hydrogen. And the reason it is called gray because there was a darker shade in black hydrogen which was used producing coal, which is not used these days, fortunately, but at some point in time that was also used. Then there is another very interesting terminology called blue hydrogen. So this is something which is essentially being propped up by a lot of oil and gas players. So if you produce gray hydrogen using natural gas, but if the carbon release is captured, stored through sequestering and storing method, then effectively they claim that it's as good as a carbon neutral, and they kind of denote that as blue hydrogen. And just to complete this color coding, you also have something called pink hydrogen when the energy used to produce hydrogen is nuclear. And there was also some talk about turquoise hydrogen, which probably is when you capture carbon in solid form, right? So we have this interesting nomenclature which you'll hear more about. A lot of regulations will come around it, and in fact within the green also I'm now hearing light green and dark green, right? So it makes for both figuratively and literally, it makes for quite colorful introduction to hydrogen to the world. And I'm sure this is going to be part of basic school science very soon. It's because it's very relevant.
Right. So basically, if I understand, it's the way you isolate that hydrogen, right? I mean, from which compound and the method in which you isolate it defines the various color coding, essentially.
Yes. So the essentially there is one particular form of energy required to isolate hydrogen, right? So it could be through a very basic electrolysis that again we all studied in school. We probably did experiments in our chemical lab. You put energy, electrical energy into water, and it's H2O splits into hydrogen and oxygen, right? So either you can do that, or there is another method called steam methane reforming, where you can directly use natural gas to isolate the hydrogen molecule, as you said. So so what form of energy is used is essentially leading to this various color combinations that we talked about.
Right. So when we talk about hydrogen as a fuel, what are some pros and cons of using hydrogen? And is it a high quality fuel? Does it compare with some of the other energy sources that we have?
Yeah. Now this again is hydrogen is a very interesting. If someone who's a chemical engineer enthusiast, it's a very interesting molecule per se. We all know hydrogen has atomic mass of 1, right, which is the lightest.
Yeah.
In popular culture, you see hydrogen balloons being used. Kids use it. We also had hydrogen-based kind of aircrafts being used earlier days, right? So in that sense, it's a very interesting molecule. But from an energy point of view, it has two very distinct and very characteristics which are almost in two different directions, right? So hydrogen has a very high gravimetric density. What does that mean? Per kg of hydrogen, the amount of energy content it has is very high, right? To give you example, energy is typically measured in kilocalorie. So 1 kg of hydrogen typically has around 32 to 33,000 kilocals of energy. If you compare that with, let's say, something like a diesel or a petrol, that will have around 11 to 12,000 kilocals of per kg.
So almost 3 times better.
Yeah. And if you compare to conventional coal or lignite, they are between 4 to 6,000 kilocal per kg. So that is why it's a super dense in terms of gravimetric volume, is how we define, the nomenclature is. But the other side, it has a very low volumetric density, because it's a light compound. So in 1 liter of you will only have around 10% by weight in 1 liter of hydrogen, right? So it's because it's a lighter compound. So essentially what it means, if you fill a room with hydrogen, it will not a lot of energy. But if you compress hydrogen and weigh it in terms of kgs, it will have a lot of energy. So this is what both the opportunity and the challenge in hydrogen. Right. Because it's a very light compound, you can't actually put it in bags or large tankers and ship it to other places. You will have to essentially compress it into a liquid form to transport it, right? Unlike oil and gas, where you don't need to compress it in liquid form, or natural gas, you don't need to compress. They are very compatible in terms of how logistically you use them, or even coal. Hydrogen needs to be first converted into liquid to make it practical for it to be transported. To convert that into liquid, you need cryogenic technologies. It's minus 274 degree cooling and pressure needs to be applied to convert hydrogen into liquid form. So this, I think, is the biggest vein you have associated with hydrogen, that logistically it is not very easy to handle because of its low volumetric density. But if you can catch hold of that factor, if you can contain that factor somehow, then of course it's a very dense source of energy. So this is both the pro and con. So because of this reason, conventionally or even today, hydrogen is not being used in large volume compared to some of the other energy sources. It's being used in a very localized fashion, where it has specialized applications in, let's say, refinery sector or some of the other industrial sector. So there is hardly any real example of large scale hydrogen being transported from one location to another, because you don't have the pipelines, the logistics are complicated, right? Think of it like LNG, right? LNG initially development took time, because again, converting gas into liquid was cryogenic technology. It was very capex heavy business. But then a related point, Roshan, which will become even more relevant and becoming more relevant to us who are in this sector, is there is another mode in which hydrogen has been conventionally used for multiple decades and probably close to a century. That is converting hydrogen into ammonia, right? Again, if I go back to school book formula, it is NH3.
NH4. Oh, NH3, sorry.
NH3, right? And there is also NH4 and related compounds, but NH3, you have ammonia, one element of one unit of nitrogen with 3 units of hydrogen. So when you convert it into ammonia, which is a relatively easier process, right? And again, let me throw up one more school time process called Haber-Bosch process, which probably we would have again studied in school. So there is again a process developed more than 100 years back called Haber-Bosch process, by which you convert hydrogen into ammonia, and then ammonia is which I at least believe is going to be the next magic fuel, because we already have large amount of use cases for ammonia. Our fertilizer industry, urea, is completely dependent on a lot of industrial applications are there in ammonia. So you have more than 200 million tons of ammonia globally being used even today. What that means, you have a full ecosystem around it. You have the logistics around it. You have pipelines using ammonia. You have shipping lines using ammonia. Industrial architecture is there around it. So what probably may happen as we see this hydrogen will perpetuate, but the debate right now is whether it will be in hydrogen in its purest form or hydrogen converted into ammonia as a carrier or as a fuel in itself, right? And that is what is now opening up huge and very, very interesting possibilities in India and globally as well, right? And that's where I'm myself seeing this policy shift and the technical shift in even last 12 to 14 months, that people now believe increasingly ammonia will not only be the lowest hanging fruit, but in the long term, ammonia may be the only fruit which may be required to use as we move towards the hydrogen or green hydrogen economy.
Right. So let me ask you, right? So what has happened in recent years that suddenly it has come to the focus? I mean, if the technology has already existed and if we always knew that hydrogen was a good fuel source, what has happened in recent times that, has put the spotlight on hydrogen as such?
Yeah. So I think this is a question a lot of time people ask me, who want to understand this sector. This is a very basic and very relevant question. None of the technologies which are being used for hydrogen are something which have been evolved in last few years. There may have been some incremental changes, but fundamental electrolysis, which is the key to generating hydrogen, has been around for multiple decades. The Haber-Bosch process, which I also mentioned for converting hydrogen into ammonia, has been there for again close to a century. Two things which are kind of I would say are converging to make this as a big phenomena right now. Number one, the global focus towards energy transition, right? So last 10 years has been all about renewable power. We all know world has done well. India in particular has done well in both solar and wind, right? But then the world realized of the overall energy that mankind uses, it uses only around 18 to 20% in the form of electricity, right? So there is only so much you can do in terms of energy transition by just using renewable energy and making it clean or renewable only for power purpose. At some point in time, the realization that policymakers had or people who in the sector has read, power has to transition into energy. Renewable power has to move into energy side to actually make a real meaningful and a sustainable difference to the whole energy landscape, right? So this energy transition theme is first that people realized we need clean energy transition. The thought till 5 years back was just doing electrical vehicles is going to be enough, or just creating what we call large scale storage mechanism. So you make power during the day and store it and then you use it will help. But in last 2 or 3 years, the thinking has changed. People realize storage has its limitations. The power storage that people are talking about. We'll have to have another mode of converting that power. And that is where people kind of dusted off this old thing about hydrogen being available. And they said, okay, we always know you can use something like a water to split it by using electricity. We have electricity. So let's split and then use hydrogen energy. So this is the first theme which is helping it, which is the energy transition. So all of a sudden, but the second theme, which I think is probably a more important kicker in terms of the trajectory, how fast we adopt, is how commercially viable is it to use electricity to convert that into hydrogen versus say using natural gas to convert it to hydrogen. And this is where this sharp decline in the cost of renewable power in last 10 years has now meant that using electricity to convert to hydrogen is not impossible to think in terms of commercial reality, right? So maybe today at today's prices, that if you can get produce electricity cheap enough in some of these parts where you have good solar radiations, then it is possible to produce hydrogen in the ballpark of let's say 20 to 30% of what it would otherwise also take to produce from, say, conventional sources of energy like natural gas. So now we are in that commercial ballpark as well. And energy transition means there is a lot of interest, a lot of money flowing, a lot of shareholder pressures for many of these companies to kind of move faster. And I think in that sense, if I can use the term, the stars seem to be aligning for this sector.
Right. So it's become commercially feasible for us to produce and distribute this source of power in that sense, right? So, right.
Yeah.
So I think go ahead, Rajat.
No, so that's the main point. Even renewable sector revolution is not because it is save the world power. India wouldn't have done so much of renewable power if we were selling at 17 rupees that Mr. Modi started in Gujarat. Today, solar is something which we are adopting very fast because on the margins it's making a lot of commercial sense. 2 rupees or 2 rupees 44 paisa.
Yeah.
It's more than any other form of electricity that we produce, and it also helps that it's clean. And I think same would happen here, right? End of the day, it's good about talking about energy transition on various forums, writing articles, but when it comes to hard bucks, it will have to commercial realities which will take precedence that we have seen on sector after sector, and that's would be the case here as well.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I think sustainability and productivity has to go hand in hand for it to be some kind of a mass transition to greener fuels, right? So I think with that background, I think it's interesting for us to get into the national hydrogen policy itself. Can you give us an overall view of the policy and what it entails?
Yes. So first, let me take a step back before I come to the recent policy announcement that has created more buzz about that sector. So if you recall, in his last Independence Day speech, Prime Minister from Red Fort, one of the key new policy areas that he mentioned that India will launch a green hydrogen mission, right? Now, I emphasize the word green here because it is not a coincidence that he mentioned green. He could have also announced a hydrogen mission like many countries have done. For example, Japan, they are announcing what is called a hydrogen mission and not necessarily a green hydrogen mission. Now, this part has a lot of implication of how the policy has come and how it will further evolve. There was a large policy debate within India that should we make it color agnostic in sense whether it should be just an hydrogen mission, people should be free to choose whether it is green or blue or maybe another color, or should we make it green hydrogen mission. There was a lot of intense policy consultation. There was a divided house, I must say. I was myself part of multiple policy consultation, including with Mr. Kant, Rajiv Kumar at Niti Aayog in the ministry. And one school of thought was India should not go with a policy where we are choosing between the color. We should just go for a hydrogen mission and let the best one evolve, whether it is green or blue. The other thought process was, which renewable players like us were championing and a lot of other neutral players were championing, was blue essentially takes care of the energy transition issue to a certain extent, but probably doesn't take care of the energy security issue, which is also another thing we need to keep focus on. Since India is primarily a hydrocarbon importing nation, if we go the blue route, which again requires natural gas or other forms of, it would essentially mean while we may have helped in the energy transition process, we may not have helped from an energy security point of view because we would still be energy dependent. So probably it was in India's route that rather than going with an intermediate blue solution, we directly jump onto the green bandwagon, right? Many of these countries, including Japan and European countries, have been discussing that, okay, eventually it will be green, but let's have initially blue and green. But then I think the eventual decision that probably the government took that green is in India's favor because then it converges both our energy security and energy transition requirement, because green would then mean we can produce that in India. We are not then dependent on importing at least that form of energy. So that is a one major policy decision that the government has already taken, right? We are going green, we are not going through blue. Doesn't mean people can't produce blue, but for that probably we will not have that kind of policy support or thrust that may be required. So that was the first real decision making that government of India did. Then the consultation started in terms of what do we then do in terms of really taking this sector off the ground, right? And the consultations again have been happening at the ministry level, power ministry, MNRE. We have had fertilizer ministry involved. We have Niti Aayog involved. So intense industry participation again in my capacity as ECME CEO. And also I am the director at Samahi, which is a policy think tank. We have written reports on green hydrogen recommendation to government. So we were all kind of getting our views across. And to be fair to government, they were all ears. None of them claimed that they know how this works. So this was a collaborative approach where they also tried to understand. And a lot of things that industry wanted for this sector to take off. Some of the points were common minimum requirement, which there was a consensus. Then there were points on which there were multiple views. So what government has done in the first round, because to my knowledge it will take many more months before you have all the points included in the policy, they have come out with what the power minister has himself described, phase 1 of the policy, right? So which came out a few days back. So I wouldn't say the policy in toto is a complete policy. I would still look at it in terms of the next stepping stones. Certain few things concretely which have come out, which I'll just list out. But this is, I would say, just the start of the policy making cycle for this sector. Right? First piece of paper, it's just a couple of pages right now. So what does it do? So it has accepted 2 or 3 very critical demands that I think was common across industry. One, industry had asked that you need not locate the renewable plant and the electrolyzer at the same location. For example, I can have my renewable power being produced in, say, Rajasthan or Gujarat, where you have good solar radiation, but my hydrogen usage may be at a different industrial location. So I can have my electrolyzers to convert that power into hydrogen at that location. So what industry had asked, that we should be allowed to transport power from point A to point B without being charged anything for using the transmission lines, right? And in this case, we are using something called ISTS, which is interstate transmission system, right? Which is our pan-India grid, which goes from one state to other state. And we asked for this sector, at least for first few years, there should be waiver of transmission charges. So this is something which the government has agreed and clearly spelled out in the first policy, which is a very important component. This has huge commercial implication because normally a transmission could cost anywhere between 40 paisa to 80 paisa, depending on various computation. So this is a straightaway advantage someone gets in terms of skin in the game from government. They are allowing their infrastructure to be used. This was one solid demand which they have agreed. Second demand is, again, I'm quite delighted they have agreed. We were not sure that would go through, is allowing something called banking of power, right? For viewers who may not be technically aware of this concept, in power sector, there is one big disadvantage with power, that unlike energy sources where you can produce and use it some other time. For example, you can produce oil and store in a tank and use later. Power is one source of energy which needs to be used instantaneously. So whenever we generate power, it needs to be used instantaneously. There is no way you can store. You can store in very small quantities in batteries, but that's not feasible at megawatt scales right now. So power needs to be used instantaneously. The implication of that is that power in the case of solar, for example, or even wind, is produced very intermittently, either through day or only certain times of the day. While electrolyzer, you need to use it for more number of hours a day, otherwise you will not have high capacity utilization, which would mean your capex will not be amortized in a shorter time frame. So what we had asked to government is we should be allowed something called banking. What does that mean? We can, let's say, feed 100 units into the grid. Then that 100 units we can take out from the grid at wherever our electrolyzer is located, need not be concurrently in terms of the temporal correlation, in terms of time should not be there. We should be allowed to take that 100 units out based on the requirement of the electrolyzer so that we can give a steady power load to electrolyzer. So this concept in electricity sector is called banking, which is not very common. Not many governments globally give this very easily. And even those who give it, they give it at a very steep cost. So government of India has agreed to this concept of banking, and they say that you can use that power within 30 days of when you actually produced it, right? At whichever time of the day you want it to be used. This, I think, bit technical, but in terms of commercial implication, has almost, I would say, 5 to 10% cost implication to the end product cost. It's a significant material part of my cost value chain. They have conceded to it, but unlike transmission, they have not made it free. They have applied a formula, which would mean there would be some cost we'll have to pay for this banking. But my initial assessment of that cost is that cost may not be prohibitive. It would still be positive for the sector to have this banking facility. So this is the second major policy direction or step that they have taken in this policy. Apart from this, there are few more measures which I can't say are in terms of concrete steps they have taken. They are in terms of guidance, or they are in terms of nudging the other associated ministries or sectors to kind of align to the requirement. So I would say these steps are work in progress, but specifically they have requested someone like a MNRE ministry to consolidate the demand of hydrogen. So rather than individual producers producing and someone else buying, they have requested to consolidate the demand as an aggregator so that it makes for a good market mechanism. So this is more in a suggestive nature right now. This needs to be implemented further. They've also asked port authorities to create storage spaces if in case hydrogen is converted to ammonia and it needs to be exported, right? So again, this is a policy nudge and not a concrete kind of a suggestion. So there are similar other measures which kind of clearly reveals the mind where the government is going. Is doesn't have the force of law at this point in time. They are in terms of direction, but that is gives a good platform for multiple ministries to kind of build upon. So this in nutshell is where the policy is. So I would say this is a second step. First step was finding green. This is the first policy phase. And I think they will have multiple rounds of policy coming, and eventually we'll need to have a law like we had for electricity, like we have for other hydrocarbon sectors, which needs to have assent of parliament to give let's say a higher level of sanctity to many of these steps, right? Because at some point in time, we all know India courts will get involved. Same happened with Aadhaar. Till it had the force of law, you had a lot of court matters hanging. But yes, I think we are maybe a bit premature for a law. Sometime in next 12 to 18 months, my personal recommendation to the authorities would be, once we get hang of series of policy steps, that should be all and then encapsulated into India's national hydrogen law or something equivalent.
So the two key points that you mentioned, whether it's the transport at zero cost or the fact that energy can be banked, right? Banking of energy. I think both of them have a thrust to making, green hydrogen commercially feasible, right? At least that is what the focus is. Now, I think I had earlier mentioned that, we had Sri Jayant Sinha on the podcast where he has proposed a bill in parliament to make net zero a reality by 2050. With that view, right, in terms of green energy and sustainability and so on and so forth, how will the hydrogen policy fit with that mission of India to go towards green and sustainable energy?
Yes, so I think it's a very, very popular podcast that Jayant Sinha gave on that subject, and he put the things in very nice macro concept in how the country needs to evolve. And since then, I think while we have not made 2050 as a net zero target, but Prime Minister has announced 2070 as the
2070,
target. Yeah. So while it is not exactly 2050, but at that point in time, not many thought that even India would even announce a net zero kind of a trajectory. But most of us are kind of glad that 2070 target is what we have announced. There is a very intricate commercial implication of whether we do it in 2050 or 2070. I need to explain. It's a very geopolitical concept, but it has huge implication. In that sense, I may be a bit divergent from what Mr. Sinha was saying. Right now, what is enabling the energy transition are not only the mandates various countries have. There is another element which probably has not got the kind of attention it should, is something called carbon pricing. Right. So what world is trying to do that at one level you have something called mandates where countries are mandated to achieve a certain level of reduction. So that is more by mandate and not necessarily only by commercial means. There is another method which world has been trying for a couple of decades with partial success, is called a clean development mechanism, a CDM mechanism, whereby you have a carbon trading market, right? So what it means is if I produce green, so you split what, in my case, let's say if I'm producing green electricity, to give an example. So you split what you produce into two components, electricity, and second component is your green attribute, right? In the evolved market, what would happen is I would sell electricity only as electricity without it being green, brown, whatever color. But I can also sell this green attribute. It could be in the form of, let's say, a certificate of carbon credit. In Europe, it's called guarantee of origin certificate, right? So that has a separate market. What does that do? If A has a certain obligation of carbon reduction, which it has not been able to do, it need not do anything else. It can produce energy the way it wants. And to kind of meet its target, he can just buy this green attribute or the certificate.
To offset it.
Right? To offset it. And this green attribute has commercial value. And suddenly this commercial value of this green certificate has increased. The carbon pricing for typical certificates have gone up to $10 under some voluntary market. The European trading scheme, it has gone up to $70 to $80 per certificate, right? Now I'll tell you what implication it has for India. And this is a concept not many policymakers in India have developed into, unfortunately, because it's a relatively more advanced concept. If we had a trajectory of 2050, every year we will have something called a nationally determined contribution that India needs to meet. So everything green that I make will be bucketed in that category, right? And if I has 2050 as my target, I would have a higher contribution to make every year, a faster trajectory to make every year. Let's now theoretically think we have a target of 2070, which means we have a less steep trajectory to make, right? So what then we can do as a country, we can actually surpass our contribution that we are officially required to do under the NDC. So if we are, let's say, supposed to do X amount, we can still give a thrust to the sector and we can, let's say, do 2X amount, right? For the balance X, that is 2X minus X, nice. We have done over and over requirement, right? And that X we can actually sell in the markets which are behind the curve, and that X will actually have a value, right? What that would mean that we effectively become exporters of green certificates, right? It forms a new form of certificate, a new form of revenue being derived by the country, and in a roundabout way, the climate financing that we as a country have been talking about, right? And this is something which I think we need to start evolving our thought on. That by all means we can still do a sharper trajectory. India has a very sharp or ambitious target in electricity or in this, but if we do it higher than what we should otherwise be required to, because for historical reasons we have a lot of carbon space left with us. The developed world has used that carbon space because they developed earlier using carbon intensive. We should not be overly generous in saying we are doing 2050, because then we don't get commercially gain. We should do it, but for doing it early through this carbon mechanism, we should get financing that we are looking for, right? And this then also fits into the climate justice concept that we've been talking to. So this is a as I mentioned, a macro concept has geopolitical consequence, which government should get into and understand. And in a way, for all we say, you don't be surprised 10 years down the line we are having other podcasts and we may actually be exporting green attributes, right? The sort of soft services that we give. So it has a lot of very interesting dimensions, Roshan, the whole move towards hydrogen, and it is in our interest if we can do what we require to do, and we can do beyond and actually monetize it.
Right. Very interesting. But just as a percentage of our green fuels, what would you attribute your numbers in terms of the green hydrogen itself? What percentage do you think it would be? Maybe let's say in the next 5 years or so.
Okay, so let me build on that answer, right? Because often it's a very ambiguous answer right now, because see, it then depends on what kind of use cases we are able to generate for hydrogen. And let's say ammonia, I'm clubbing both ammonia and hydrogen because one is an offshoot of another. So the potential use cases are, of course, green ammonia can be used to replace gas fertilizer straight away. It can be used for various refinery applications. Hydrogen and or ammonia can be blended with natural gas, right? Without making too many changes in the pipeline. At some point in time, hydrogen can be used in vehicles, at least for long distance vehicle or commercial transportation. So general theory is electrical vehicles will be for personal transportation or shorter distance transport, and hydrogen based vehicles will be for commercial or long distance transport.
Freight and stuff. Okay.
That is another use case which can come up very quite fast if we get the policy right. Then you get into things like green steel, where hydrogen used is green, which is a concept becoming very relevant, and it will become more relevant. Then we go into the mother of all carbon emission sources. For example, shipping right now uses something called bunker oil, which is one of the most polluting fuel, and shipping is probably the second or the third largest carbon emission sector in the world. So now there is talk of replacing bunker oil with ammonia based fuel system, right? So if you start getting all these flanks working together, right, multiple use cases coming up, I think a very broad range of number is that hydrogen can actually touch almost 30 to 40% of the energy sector that we use today. And then this may be a bit conservative. It maybe I won't say 10 years is a time frame. Let's say between 10 to 20 years, because what trajectory it takes, you never know. Smartphone, for example, suddenly caught up. People were saying it will be 2020. So if it builds critical mass in some of this sector, we faster adoption than we have seen. So I would say within 10 to 20 years, almost 30 to 40% of energy sector can see either adoption or green hydrogen touching in a very, very meaningful way, right? By 2050, various estimates suggest that we can almost do 50% of energy greening through, say, hydrogen, right? So that is the disruptive nature of implication hydrogen can have in terms of the overall number and in terms of the individual sectors I just mentioned.
So one of the facets that you brought up is energy security, and we have this energy dependency, and given the geopolitical situation right now, where there's a war happening, and we might have to stitch together trade agreements with different kind of entities and alliances and so on and so forth. Given all of this unpredictability, right, how will the move towards green hydrogen help us become atmanirbhar?
See, there are 3 or 4 elements to atmanirbhar concept in terms of how we see, let's say, green hydrogen evolving, right? One thing that we see, and again, I'm driving some lessons from the renewable sector success, or largely a success story. While we as a country where we have been successful in adding large amount of capacity of renewable power, specifically solar power, one area where we must the bus is our dependency on modules to China. So, and now we are trying to course correct in terms of policy action or tariff barriers, which are usually not a very good way to do it, but probably within our policy choice space, that's something which we are implementing now. But all this growth that we did in renewable sector, it's still on the back of Chinese modules that we imported. So yes, to the extent that energy import was reduced or can be reduced, but we still had a lot of capital good import that happened to enable this sector. So one thing which I'm happy in a way that government is cognizant here, that they don't want to lose sight of the fact that we don't want to create another sector purely on the basis of Chinese goods being, I won't use the word dump, but large scale adoption of Chinese goods. So the atmanirbhar at a slightly micro level here is ensuring that various parts of the value chain, whether it is the solar sector, where now we are making policy action, or whether it is electrolyzer, or whether other balance of plant components are largely produced within India, or India has the capability to do it, and we simultaneously work on propping those sectors. That is the first Atmanirbhar concept, which government is very cognizant of. When you see the second phase of policy, you will see there would be elements of this being integrated into the policy, so that our ecosystem is largely India-based ecosystem and certainly not reliant on one country like China. The second element of Atmanirbhar is how quickly we adopt this and how quickly we then replace some of the hydrocarbon fuels that we were otherwise importing, right? So if, for example, we start blending this into natural gas, right? And people are saying we can do a blending of 20% without too much of technical adaptations to be done. So to that extent, our natural gas demands as it stands today, or the incremental demand, which mostly we are dependent on import natural gas, gets replaced. So in a way, this is one more building block into the energy security and in a way Atmanirbhar concept. Third, there is a very important facet which we, at least I would propose, urge government to give even more focus on, is not actually looking at reducing import, but actually looking how do we export some of this. Question is, what do we export? One very interesting element I mentioned was the green attributes, right? But that's out of a different mechanism altogether. But in terms of more tangible, India is reasonably well placed to actually import things like green ammonia, right? Early adopter countries like Japan, Korea, and even Europe, they are not blessed with very good natural resource. And we are anticipating a large boom in international demand. So you not only become Atmanirbhar, and you reduce your net energy demand if we actually become exporter in certain sectors, and we have reasonably good solar resource. I won't say we have the best solar resources in the world. There are countries who are better than India, but they are countries in say Middle East or some North African countries have better solar. So we are reasonably good. I would say we would be at 75 percentile in terms of countries having good solar resource. So we should leverage that and become export hub. That will also help our Atmanirbhar concept. Another third element, and which is where I think India is doing reasonably well, can be a lot of this new sector would require companies from India or Indian talent on the implementation of project side or the engineering talent to implement this sector, right? Essentially, we are doing a global energy system which has been developed over last couple of decades, a couple of centuries, and we are in next 30-40 years we're going to redo the whole system, right? That would require a lot of new building, new plants being built, new technologies being implemented and adopted, right? So this is where a lot of Indian engineering talent can be used. And in fact, I was quite pleasantly surprised when we were scanning various global projects. A lot of these global projects are actually getting a lot of their engineering work, front-end engineering work, back-end engineering work being done by Indian engineers sitting in places like Baroda, Faridabad, Pune, right? So this is something where in terms of knowledge, we have again, I won't call it to the extent that it will be a sector like a software sector in India, but again, in terms of huge energy sector, in terms of exporting our engineering talent is again something which we are doing okay, and we can do much better, right? So if you combine all this together, the picture you can have potentially in a couple of decades is we have reduced our hydrocarbon imports. We have added more sectors where we can actually export stuff, whether physical export or in form of services, right? And we have also developed a large scale know-how, because if we are going to be among the first few countries to start developing these kind of projects, we also very rapidly develop know-how, and which is what the world would need. It would then be dependent on Indian contractors or Indian developers to develop projects even outside India. So we will start then in that sense playing a much more vital role in the overall energy metrics of the world, which we are a fringe player right now.
So for R&D and also, for it to become commercially viable, I think private player participation is very, very important. So what is the kind of progress that you're seeing on that front?
Yes, so I think see, one thing is for given, Roshan, gone are the days that any sector will be driven by any PSU, right? For whatever reason, good or bad. It will have to be driven by Indian private sector companies. And in this particular case, you could have unique blend of two kind of companies. You can have the large, well-established mega business houses who come into the sector. That is where you have seen huge announcements from likes of Reliances and Adani's and even Tatas are getting into it. But there is also space for relatively smaller, nimble-footed players like say Acme, right, who are more entrepreneurial, more technology-driven, to create a space for themselves within India and maybe also outside like we are doing. So I think this is a sector ripe for unleashing the full potential of both Indian entrepreneurial and Indian large business houses. And what form and shape the sector takes is something which I would say is a bit ambiguous right now. But there will be various facets of the sector which will come in, and that is where I think a lot of companies will have a role to play, including the big business houses, and we are seeing it that way. I'm happy, as I mentioned earlier, that unlike in past policy making, there is a clear acknowledgement within the policy making circles of government that this is where they need to consult the industry because they themselves may not have any reference to start their policy making. There are not too many global references either. So we have to start from zero. And right now it is in true sense of public-private partnership, at least in the sense of policy making that I'm pursuing. Second element is R&D of various aspects. So again, here I have a slightly different view than many of the conventional view. I think in terms of cutting edge R&D, in terms of developing purely new technologies, there are lots of work, very good work happening in European countries, Germany, Japan, who are much more enabled to do this kind of work. And coincidentally, various Indians are also involved when they're studying there. So I am not sure we can catch that bus. What we can certainly do is how do we frugalize any of these things, right? What Indians have been good at in various sectors is if you know a reasonable good solution, how do you create a frugal engineering around it, a frugal delivery mechanism around it, a frugal supply chain mechanism around it. This is where I think right now India needs to have its very, very clear focus as and be part of various forums where R&D activities are going on. I don't think our technological university system is enabled to do a cutting edge research on this right now, right? Not to say we should not take a lead in any other sector. There are other places where we can start working now, but here we should be more collaborative with people who are already taking a lead, but focus on value engineering, focus on creating, economies of scale and ways of commercially delivering stuff. I think that's where our core strength is. That's where Indians have been good traditionally at, and that is where I personally think we should focus at, rather than just creating some government budgeting for some resource which may not have any accountability in terms of connecting with industry requirements.
Right. I think if it becomes viable from a jobs and employment perspective, with some of the larger corporates stepping in, I think we will see a lot more talent entering in the sector as well, right? There was some talk of a Reliance Gigafactory, for example, and Mukesh Ambani himself has said plenty of things specific to green hydrogen itself. So on that front, I think it looks promising. So we've discussed plenty about the elements of the policy itself, but Rajat, if you had to extend this policy further, what are some of those key additions you will make, to what we already have?
So there are two specific buckets of action which I think are very important for this policy to reach to a stage where people start investing physical rupee or dollars on ground. So there are a couple of things I mentioned which were, I would say, necessary condition, not sufficient, but necessary condition which government has already kind of dwelled into and clearly articulated, both in terms of policy and in terms of direction. There are few very, very fundamental, I would say almost operative kind of stuff that now needs to be coming in policy side. So let me give example. Financing, see, when you do these projects of green hydrogen or renewable projects, they are very highly capex oriented project. Your operational cost is close to zero because your natural resource, sun is what you're using, you don't pay for sun, right? So you don't have to have very large operational costs. So the economics of any project is fundamentally driven by the capex that you're spending, and the biggest cost to the capex. So I always say the biggest commodity we use in this project is not steel or modules or anything. The biggest commodity we use is actually money. and how cheap you can get that money is the single biggest determinant of how commercially viable I or anyone else can make the end product in a very capex intensive sector. So there are multiple things can be done. One thing which requires policy action, which is a relatively low hanging fruit, is if Government of India ensures all procurement of green hydrogen or related stuff is dollar denominated. Right. So the revenue stream for a developer or an investor for this kind of project, if it is dollar denominated, then he can get debt and even equity in dollar terms. What that would mean is straight away the cost of lending comes down by 300 to 400 basis points. So if I get a rupee term loan, I would typically get at 9 to 10% for infra or this kind of projects. But if I have an equivalent project where my revenues are in dollar guaranteed, then the cost of debt to me is probably 4 or 5%. And mind you, from coming from 9 to 5 or 4 is not a reduction of 4%. The biggest cost to my project is money, and the cost of that money has come down by half, from 9 to say 4.5%, right? People, till you put those numbers and actually do not realize the importance of interest rate to enabling these projects, right? It's not a 4% reduction for me. 80% of my cost has come by half, right? So it has huge implication. Now, the reason we say dollar denominated, it is not as revolutionary or as disruptive for government, because see, even today when we purchase any of these energy products, whether it is oil or gas, we purchase in dollar denomination. To the extent an oil or a gas product produced in India, even that is purchased in dollar denomination. The settlement may happen in rupee in an equivalent exchange rate after considering the equivalent exchange rate, but the commercial underpinning is always in dollar. So this is one very solid recommendation we had in the report I did with Samai and in the various consultation, that if you can make it dollar denominated, straight away, one, you reduce the cost, two, you open up a huge financing market outside India for players like us, and end product is you have a cheaper end product, right? There could of course be counter argument that if someone buys the product for 20-25 years, he's actually exposed to rupee dollar exchange rate. So there are merits to that argument, but in general what happens is it will still be cheaper for end product to be dollar denominated rather the capex to be dollar rupee denominated, right? So that analysis is there. So this is one very specific policy recommendation we need to do and the government needs to implement. Third is a clear timetable of aggregating hydrogen and ammonia demand and making clear mandates. What this policy doesn't have, I missed mentioning in my initial part, is it doesn't come on the demand side of ammonia. It has started to unshackle the production side in terms of giving benefits. But how do you underpin a demand? How do you create a trajectory of demand? You have examples in India. Renewable took off initially because there was a mandatory demand of certain percentage to be renewables. CNG took off in India because it was mandated by law or by court orders. Similarly, hydrogen in sectors, hard to abate sector as we call it, needs to have a mandate trajectory, right? Let's call it hydrogen purchase obligation for the end user industry. It could start with a modest number of, let's say, 10 or 20%, and we need to clearly have a trajectory so that people who are investing know that clearly a demand is coming, and at some point in time, maybe 3 years or 4 years on the line, the prices would have attained parity. So it would no need to be purely on commercials. As I said, we are not too far off. The product will start pushing itself like it happened with renewable. So this is a second very specific policy measure that the government needs to take. Third is in a wish list category, I would say, but important one, that one of the best policy measures that I think there is a general consensus government has taken is something called PLI, production linked incentive, right? Why is it good? Because you take any subjectivity out. If someone produces, he gets the money. So you don't have cases of policy failing. Alignment of interest is very strong. Production has to happen. So the factors of labor and employment creation is clearly linked with it, right? What we have been recommending is you need to have equivalent PLI scheme in the sector, right? Within PLI, there has been two schools of thought. One school of thought is have PLI for critical equipment like say electrolyzers, so that the production of electrolyzers happen in India. And that argument has its merit. We in ACME, and I would say in my capacity, has been arguing that PLI should be focused towards not on the intermediate product, but on the final product. So the PLI should be for hydrogen produced or ammonia produced. So that if you have the incentive at the last end of the chain, every other element that is required to produce the end product automatically gets aligned, right? For example, if you were to incentivize producing aircraft, you would give PLI on producing aircraft or not the steel which goes into aircraft. That would be my logic, but I don't want to dismiss the other school of thought. They also have good meritorious argument. But government of India needs to have a good solid PLI scheme to ensure this sector has an early takeoff in India, right? So you have a limited PI for next 2-3 years, and that would certainly ensure not only Indian companies companies, various other international investors would want to join the bandwagon. So these three, I would say, are at a slightly more macro, more material level policy actions that that can, that are almost certainly required for this sector to take off in a big way, right? Right now, we are still on drawing board stage, making our policies, looking at what kind of demand is there. But once this comes in, and I believe government is working on that in next few months, we can actually start seeing real projects on ground also taking off.
So on the second point that you mentioned, right, in terms of demand aggregation and so on, right? So on the consumer side, is there any significant advantage for using hydrogen as a fuel? Because then in that case, the government can actually mandate people using and so on, right? So for instance, CNG is cheaper than normal conventional fuel, and so it makes sense for us to use it in, let's say, auto rickshaws or wherever else, right? So how would you look at it from the consumer side of things?
So it's I think again a more relevant question. See, right now as things stand, right? Like was the case with CNG. When CNG initially started, there was a lot of resistance. If you remember, 20 years back, protest and other things. It was initially not the economics which was driving it, right? As CNG took off, your cost of converting a vehicle into a CNG vehicle became cheaper, right? There was certain priority allocation of natural gas for CNG sector. Those factors actually meant that CNG became cheaper. Correspondingly, the alternate costs of fuel like petrol, diesel also kept increasing. That meant that purely from a variable cost of point of view, CNG maintained its commercial edge, right? In this sector of hydrogen, from a purely economics point of view, we may not be right now cheaper than what is being used conventionally, which is a conventional source of power. But we are not very expensive either. We will be in the ballpark of 20 or 30%. In fact, if you do computation on today's oil and gas prices, right? Today's oil prices are close to $100, and natural gas prices are also $25 per MMBTU or higher. If I use only today's reference point, we may actually be cheaper, right? But I don't want to use that because that's a slightly misleading comparison, because there would be some reversion to mean even in the conventional prices. So oil may not remain at 100 or natural gas may not remain at 25. So I would say initially, if you purely ask from a commercial point of view, in India, the green movement is not there. Unlike in Europe, a customer is not asking that give me green, right? That level of percolation, that there is a demand pull for green per se outside of economics has not unfortunately happened in India. In due time it would, right? Like, if in a funny way, if you ask if it's the same activists who are kind of stopping metro projects for want of cutting tree, if their idea was to reduce carbon emission, they could do multiple time positive service to the country if they were to kind of use their positive movement towards asking people to create a demand for green, right? So people should ask, I need green power, I need green hydrogen. So that will create a market. Unfortunately, that advocacy has not happened. The advocacy in India has taken a different route, and this is a controversial topic, so I don't go there. But I'm saying we still don't have a customer pull, if that's the question, not beyond a very small percentage of people. So right now it will have to be an industry pull. What industry can then do after the mandates are there, they can then think of monetizing some of the green aspects, as I mentioned. They can, if for example, if a steel producer produces green steel in India, what is green steel? If he's using electricity through renewables or using green hydrogen in the process, he can actually monetize by saying, okay guys, I am saying green steel to the global market, and that green steel has a premium over a conventional steel. For example, BMW or one of these marquee car companies have announced all the steel that goes into their car would be green steel, right? Again, that's a nomenclature. So you would then create markets for yourself, right? So one would build into another. But if you ask me today, is there a immediate benefit to be seen? No. Immediate benefit is not to be seen, and that is why this requires policy measure. This requires government's foresight.
So you described in the earlier podcast that a strong political will and more importantly cooperation from the state governments is necessary for any kind of power reforms in India, right? I mean, like we see with collections and so on. In that regard, what role can Indian states play in enabling the sector with respect to this hydrogen policy specifically?
I think that is again a very important cog in making any policy or success, right? So let me tell you, Government of India has shown resolve, intent on competency. They are developing it because it's a new sector. So there is a madness. There is some method to it, I would say, in policy making, but because it's not clear which ministry would lead it, which department would do it. There are interministerial stuff being involved. There is an energy transition group that government has made that will get involved. So I think there is a hustle and bustle on the policy making side, and I think it will become even more clearer in next few months, especially we are even more hopeful after the first phase of the policy is done. Where I think the rubber will meet the tar, as we call it, is in states coming out with very specific implementation related policies, right? For example, I want to set up plants in coastal states of India because maybe as ACME, I think I will have an export market to target first. Which states gives me enough facilitation so that I choose that state? I can choose any of the coastal states. I can choose Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Orissa, Andhra, right? Now, this is where the competitive spirit, animal spirits need to come in within the state policy making circle. And again, I have some positive feeling about it. I know for sure states like Tamil Nadu, state like Gujarat, they are active on the policies. Even states like Karnataka started showing some initial inklings of policy making. So the state needs to get active, right? But what do they need to do specifically, right? One is making a policy, what policy to what good? So questions they need to ask themselves in their policy making is, can they provide large enough tracts of land for making it easier for people to set up plants, right? Can they provide access to ports or jetty facilities for setting this? Can they facilitate in transmission line, in setting of transmission lines from one area where I generate renewable power to where I generate, let's say, hydrogen and ammonia? Can they facilitate in terms of capital subsidies that they have been otherwise giving to various other sectors to attract them to their states? Can they do that, right? So these are some of the questions that various states need to ask while they are making policy. I know for fact certain of these policies states are trying to entertain some of these aspects in their state specific policies. So as far as states are concerned, right now, see, central government, we have only one government, so there's no competition per se. There's competition with other countries. Now the competitive spirits within the states needs to kick in, and as usual, I'm expecting certain states to be ahead of the other in this, and it helps that they are started to consult various players in this sector while they shape this policy. So you are going to hear a lot of these policy statements and actual notifications coming in at least one or two states in next few months, I'm anticipating, right, which will enable capital investment decisions by groups like ours.
Right. So on another note, the policy also has some forward looking statements, right, in terms of upgrading the infrastructure of the power grid and so on. So will we also see more renewables being introduced to the grid?
Certainly, Rohan. See, I think again, we all know the headline number in renewables is that we as a country wanted to do 160 gigawatts by 2023, and then the Prime Minister revised that target a couple of years back to 450 gigawatts by 2030, right? 450 gigawatts is a lot of power. India's total capacity of power, all sectors, all forms of power combined today is roughly 370 or 380 gigawatts. Renewables is around 100 gigawatt. So we are talking about renewables itself going to 450 gigawatt in terms of aspiration. There is no way you can set up that kind of capacity because power will not have that level of usage in India, not in next 5 or 7 years, right? What do you do with all this electricity? So you need to move that electricity into energy, as I was discussing earlier, right? So which would mean for generating every extra molecule of hydrogen or ammonia, I would then use some of these capacities within this 450 gigawatt bracket, right? So you will certainly see a lot more renewable capacities coming. That is where there is already a momentum. It can be further, the gears can be further shifted upwards. Again, the enabling environment, which I also touched in a state context, but in the national context is how do you have grids transferring this large quantum of power from one area of the country to another area, and which is where one of the positive developments I would say has happened over 5-6 years is, as a country, we have developed very nice capabilities of large scale power transfer from power producing region to power users region. So we now have a national grid. We didn't have it. Surprisingly, till 5 years back, you would see one part of the country having deficiency of power, another part of the country having sufficiency or excess of power, right? And now, because of national grid, not many people have realized, it's not been appreciated, that we are one large grid that allows the diversity of our production in various states to play out, right? So various states producing higher power can actually ship it to other places, which is also giving us a strategic advantage as a country. Large grid has a lot of advantage. So you will see further consolidation of this. I think just a couple of weeks back, government has announced next phase of investment into high voltage transmission lines through power grid, as you mentioned. So this is an essential component to enable hydrogen economy, and this converges with the renewable targets we have. And this is one part of the piece which is functioning, I would say, reasonably well right now.
Right. So finally, when we look at the hydrogen economy globally, Japan, South Korea, Australia, all of them have made strides to move ahead on this axis, right? So how does India compare? And while the policies start, what can we do to kind of catch up with all of the rest of the world?
Roshan, here one thing interesting, as I was discussing with a few other industry people as well. In terms of policy making and statement of India, fortunately, this is one sector where we may not have to play a catching up game, right? We have not missed the bus. If we do well, we may have just about caught the bus at the right time, right? So it is not as if the globally, whether it is Europeans or some of these far east countries who are too much ahead of us, right? So we are within few years of each other right now in terms of the state at which policy making is. And that is why it is important we gain size and relevancy in this quickly, because size is our advantage, right? And we will not waste time in catching up with the developed world like we have done in various other sectors, you would know that. So in terms of policy making, we are relatively at par with some of these countries. You mentioned Japan, you mentioned Korea, you mentioned Europe. So even those countries have still not come out with mandates. They've been talking about it for a couple of years. I'm expecting specific mandates to come out maybe within this year, right? So they are not ahead. The only country which I think is planning it more meticulously is Japan. Because in Japan, what happens is once the government makes a particular intent, every industry body, every conglomerate that they very quickly align with it. There is a lot of value to any announcement that is made by Japanese government. So I clearly right now see them trying to create an ecosystem of demand. They have started blending on an experimental basis ammonia into coal boilers, right? That itself will underpin a demand. They've started doing pilot vessels on hydrogen, run on hydrogen. So they in a way are right now the leading light. Unfortunately, conventional wisdom at suggests Europeans are going to take the lead, but while they have been the ones who have been giving the intent very clearly, somehow they have not been able to translate that into very, very specific policy and regulatory action as fast as at least I anticipated few years back, right? So to come to your question, we are not behind on this, so we may not be catching up, right? If we continue this momentum, there would be early. So we need some early wins, right? And to build the success. So we are not behind it. Yes, one area where I think India needs to do a bit more work is, while see, this sector eventually would not be a sector where a country captively produces and captively uses. The way ammonia sector or hydrogen sector would evolve, mostly ammonia would evolve, is you will have places in the world where you produce large scale ammonia cheaply, where you have good solar resources, and then you have places where there are markets, right? For example, Middle East or African countries, they will produce, but they may not have the market, but then they would transport to, let's say, Japan and Europe. So you will have that typical play that you have with any commodity of regions producing it and regions consuming it, and a global logistics making the playing the market making mechanism. So India is still not being considered by at least the Western powers or the Far Eastern countries as a serious hub for export of green ammonia. This is where I think government can do some early movement and encourage export. And some of these companies, either it is Acme or some of the other companies we discussed, they set up some of these facilities. So in that case, we will also be in serious play as far as this global market for green ammonia is considered. Right. So that is something which I think we can put a bit more thrust in next few months as we evolve our Indian local ecosystem.
I think the fact that we have a significant domestic consumption, maybe more than perhaps, given the enormous size of India, right, and also means how some of these geopolitical factors are playing out. I think it may accelerate production of this, green hydrogen in India, I feel, right?
So that is true. Eventually, Indian demand itself will be a large market, right?
Yeah.
The point I was trying to essentially make, Roshan, was yes, we should do whatever is required for the Indian market, but there are markets outside India who are willing to pay that high price, right? You asked me a question of what happens to the consumer. So there are markets in Japan who can potentially pay 2 times what we can pay in India right now, right? And while we work very, very meticulously ourselves on Indian market, but to make a splash, let's say, into the sector, right? We should be, and when I say we, I refer to the industry per se, the government efforts collectively as a country, that we should kind of try and be early movers even in this export market, which is going to be probably much larger, much quicker, right? And which is going to be more commercially lucrative as well. So that is something which we should not lose sight of as we develop our own market, which also I'm pretty sure sooner rather than earlier would be of material size for this industry to take off.
Right, absolutely. This has been a fascinating conversation, Rajat. I think we have uncovered plenty of nuances with respect to the policy and the power sector itself. So thank you again for joining us on this episode of Bharatvaarta.
Thanks, Roshan. I think this was very, very interesting, and I'm happy the dialogue on this sector has started getting more mainstream attention because this is going to be, in my belief, the biggest energy disruption in our lifetime at least. Thanks.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.